Chapter 3, Capitalism. Some of you may say, wait a minute, this isn't capitalism, this is mercantilism. Mercantilism is the idea that for a nation to be strong, it has to be self-sustaining. If it doesn't have the resources, it must go out and take the resources of someone else. It must control the supply of said good. It must also make all the finished products in their home country to create jobs while subjugating their colonies to just produce raw goods and be dependent on them for finished goods. Capitalism, on the other hand, is a very fuzzy term that means a lot of things to a lot of people. The word didn't even come into being until after the Civil War, around the time that Marx wrote Das Kapital. To people in favor of it, capitalism is the free market, the ability to exchange goods and services without a central authority telling people what they have to buy and how to set the price. This sort of thing was discussed in Adam Smith's On the Wealth of Nations. To people against capitalism, it refers to the ownership of stock in a company using money to make money off of the labor of others. Both are equally valid definitions, as they both came into use at the same time in history, but only one ended up in the dictionary. America was founded on free market capitalism, but with a very big catch. Corporations as we know them had zero bankruptcy protection, making them a non-viable option, as if the businesses failed, creditors could go after the shareholders too. This is where, in the Constitution, the government has the right to regulate every aspect of corporations. They could, with just a vote, dismantle all bankruptcy protections, ending corporations, and be completely constitutional. The Boston Tea Party was not only about taxation without representation, but also they were angry that the British East India Company basically owned members of parliament and were able to hold a tea monopoly in the American colonies. After the nation was founded, their hatred and distrust of corporations were baked into their laws. Corporations required the state legislatures to approve them on a yearly basis. They could only trade in one commodity and had to be dissolved yearly and reapply. Corporations in the U.S. were viewed as temporary things, not an immortal entity like they are now. They were usually only created when they could find no other way to let an individual or partnership provide said service. Corporations are so standard that what was once called a private owner or partnership is now an LLC or C Corp for legal reasons, and I'm not referring to them when using the word corporations. This is why the National Bank was looked on so unfavorably. The First Bank of America did not have its charter renewed after 20 years and dissolved. The Second Bank of America was killed by Andrew Jackson. Corporations were treated this way for the first 50 years of the nation, and after Andrew Jackson left office, Connecticut passed the first general incorporation law that allowed one to incorporate without state congressional approval. All other states soon followed. However, corporations were still heavily regulated for the next 50 years, which is why Andrew Carnegie used a limited partnership and John Rockefeller used a trust and finagled it to create a monopoly legally. However, the Civil War changed everything. After the war, without slavery, instead of it becoming a fair exchange of labor, many war profiteers got into politics and began to change the Republican Party from a free labor party to a pro-business party, and by pro-business they meant pro-corporation, and began to increase the scope and power and bankruptcy protections for corporations. First the trusts and monopolies, and later the corporate giants that emerged after the Antitrust Act was passed. Almost immediately, labor abuse began. If a corporation or trust could figure out some way to screw over their workers, they would, often bringing in prisoners, most of whom were former slaves charged on dubious crimes, to undercut free labor pay, or to bring in desperate immigrants to also undercut pay. And since these people didn't know their rights, weren't used to American freedoms, and had issues with the language, they were often treated no better than the prisoners. Also, many of the companies were in remote areas such as coal country, and government reach was pretty much nil. These remote area workers had zero safety protections, and the company would do anything to keep them as workers. An example would be the company store, which was essentially indentured servitude. The company had a monopoly on any good you could purchase, so they would jack the prices up, and if you tried to run away, they could legally grab you as a free citizen and drag you back until you had repaid your debt. And since you had to buy stuff, you would never get out of debt, so it was slavery, just with more steps. Chapter 4. The Untold Story of Patent Laws and Marxism. The Second Industrial Revolution, made possible by government spending creating the standardized system of replaceable parts that was the first American invention that blew the rest of the world away, and whose patents were made open source by law if a factory had a government contract, should have been a massive boon for the average American worker. Instead, the new pro-business government changed the patent laws. The new technology decimated old jobs, which was great, but it also decimated the communities and networking protections they had created, ensuring labor abuse was going to happen. The government was truly owned by trusts at this time, as the founders had so feared. And with socialism, communism, and anarchism spreading, the idea of unionizing to the workers as alternative ideas to what they were experiencing, the government would happily supply soldiers, militia, and secret agents called Pinkertons to come in and bust heads, or even massacre some of them. Ireland had it even worse, as they were a subject nation and essentially a tributary, and had few to no rights. Massacres happened in mass. British corporations got the military help to prevent any unionizing. But then most of Europe was used to anti-unionizing, as the lines blurred between serfdom and modern free labor, and lords and the modern wealthy. It was in this time that Karl Marx wrote Das Kapital. In his younger years, he had helped to write the Communist Manifesto in London with Friedrich Engels, back when the term communism really was just synonymous with socialism and just about anything that involved unionizing and government providing for things. Communism, as the Soviets know it, was a utopian yet inevitable ideal that Marx believed that at a certain point, automation would move us into a post-scarcity era much like Star Trek or space communism as it's jokingly referred to. He knew it would take centuries and a phase of regulated capitalism to build up the infrastructure, both mental and physical, to reach that level of automation. Sadly, Stalin believed pseudoscientists that the level of prosperity and automation was just decades away, leading to the death of millions, through starvation from poor farming techniques. Unlike what most Americans are led to believe, automation was the very core of the philosophy. Most of the beginning of the Communist Manifesto is praising capitalism, or the bourgeois class, for rapidly destroying the old systems of feudalism and ramping up automation. He viewed it as a wonderful thing, but with some of the same problems that Adam Smith warned about. And like Smith pointed out, that the assembly line and factory work drained the personal satisfaction of seeing the results of their hard work, making them incredibly dull people, or as Marx called it, alienation. But he took the problem even further, that automation in the first industrial revolution had destroyed not only the old feudalism and lordships, but also had broken the old guilds and communities. And there became a repeated pattern of automation destroying communities and jobs, and therefore destroying worker pay protections, ensuring that the very rich could easily gain more and more money off of the labor of the workers doing the actual work. Other than Marx's disagreement with the abuses of minorities and women, Marx would have gotten on quite well with some of the founding fathers, especially Thomas Paine, who spoke strongly for a welfare state, though also with most of them for their distrust of corporations and idealization of workers owning their own personal property and means of production. Though by the time of his death and publishing of Das Kapital, corporate interests that both Marx and the founders hated and feared had taken over the U.S. His use of the word capitalism really only referred to the corporations or wealthy people who made money off of labor and others, while anyone could make as much money off of their own labor using the free market, which other economists at the time began making synonyms with the word capitalism. Which is why if you're having an argument with a socialist and they start hating on capitalism and you start defending it, both are legitimate definitions, but you may be talking about completely different things. Marx was for destroying slavery, destroying marriage as it was at the time, which was a man essentially owning a woman and his kids, setting up unions to control and collectively own the means of production, most likely through the government, and prevent that labor from being undervalued and rich people getting fat off of the hard work of the individual worker. He was also for the welfare state to protect anyone who either couldn't care for themselves or who was in job transition from automation destroying their jobs. And no government had ever had that amount of power he idealized. He was a little naive in how dangerous that type of government could be in restricting freedom, even though he was all for freedom and democracy as a cornerstone of government, but didn't stress it as much as he should have, as those were jettisoned from the dogmatic following of his work by the communist nations that claimed to represent his ideology, even though he would have been horrified by the actions done in his name, if he had still been alive. It is funny that in communist China, Marx is required reading as gospel, and so young people are starting to try and unionize, and the Communist Party is crushing it. His works had the biggest impact on labor thought throughout the world and caused the uprising and struggles of unions, even if they didn't buy into all of his ideas. If your parent was in a union and fought for the good cost of living you grew up with, you can thank Marx for some of that.